I never thought I'd be the kind of person to betray someone I loved, but life has a way of surprising you, testing your resolve in ways you never imagined. This is the story of how I found myself in an affair with my best friend's husband, a man I should have seen as untouchable, someone I should have respected as much as I respected her. It's a story of passion, temptation, and the devastating consequences that follow. If you think you know where this is headed, I urge you to keep reading, because the truth is always more complicated than it seems. Catherine and I had been inseparable since college. We were the kind of best friends who did everything together, shared our secrets, our dreams, our frustrations. We leaned on each other through breakups, bad jobs, and all the twists and turns life threw our way. When she met Mark, I was genuinely thrilled for her. He was charming, successful, and he adored her in a way that made everyone else envious. They were the perfect couple, the kind you looked at and thought, if they can't make it, no one can. I was her maid of honor at their wedding, and I meant every word of my speech when I said I wished them a lifetime of happiness. But things have a way of changing when you're not paying attention. Over the years, Mark and I had become close as well. He was easy to talk to, and we often found ourselves deep in conversation at dinners, parties, and the many events we all attended together. I never thought anything of it. It was natural, given how much time we all spent together. He was my best friend's husband, after all, practically family. Then came the night that changed everything. Catherine had gone out of town for a work conference, and I was left alone in the city we all called home. Mark called me one evening, saying he was feeling a bit lonely and wondered if I wanted to grab dinner. It wasn't unusual. We'd all hung out together before when Catherine was away. I didn't think twice about saying yes. We met at a small Italian restaurant downtown, one that Catherine and I had frequented many times before. The evening started off as it always did, casual, friendly, two people catching up over good food and wine, but as the night wore on, something shifted. I can't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but I started noticing things. Subtle, almost imperceptible changes in the way Mark looked at me, the way his eyes lingered on mine a little too long, the way his hand brushed mine when he reached for his wine glass. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things, but there was an undercurrent of tension between us that I couldn't ignore. After dinner, Mark suggested we go for a walk. The city was alive with the buzz of a Friday night. The streets filled with people laughing, talking, enjoying themselves. We walked in silence for a while, the noise of the city fading into the background as we made our way through the crowded streets. Eventually, we found ourselves in a quiet park, the only sounds the rustling of leaves in the trees and the distant hum of traffic. We sat down on a bench, the night air cool against our skin. Mark turned to me, his expression serious in a way I wasn't used to seeing. "I feel like we don't talk as much as we used to," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him surprised. "What do you mean? We talk all the time." He shook his head. "Not like we used to, not like this." He paused, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't quite understand. "I miss this, you know? Just talking, just being here with you." I felt a flutter in my chest, a sensation I hadn't felt in a long time. I told myself it was just the wine, that I was reading too much into his words, but the truth was I missed it too. I missed the ease of our conversations, the way we used to talk about everything and nothing, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the room. "I miss it too," I admitted, my voice barely audible. Mark reached out and took my hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, his eyes locked on mine. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Of course." He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I can't stop thinking about you," he finally said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know I shouldn't, but I can't help it." His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and I felt a rush of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. This was Mark, my best friend's husband, the man who was supposed to be untouchable. How could I feel anything for him? How could I even entertain the thought of betraying Catherine like this? But even as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I knew it was wrong, so wrong, but the temptation was overwhelming. "Mark, we can't," I began, my voice trembling. He nodded, his grip on my hand tightening. "I know, believe me, I know, but that doesn't change how I feel." His confession sent a thrill through me, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt so intense it nearly took my breath away. I had to stop this before it went any further, before we crossed a line we could never uncross. "We need to go," I said, pulling my hand away from his. "This isn't right." Mark looked at me, his expression filled with a mix of regret and longing. "You're right," he said softly. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything." But the damage was already done. The words had been spoken, the feelings laid bare, and there was no going back. We left the park in silence, the tension between us thick and suffocating. I knew I should have ended it there, should have walked away and never looked back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us, something that couldn't be ignored. The next few weeks were a blur of confusion and guilt. I tried to avoid Mark, to put some distance between us, but it was impossible. We were bound by our friendship with Catherine, by the life we had all built together. And every time I saw him, every time our eyes met, the tension between us grew stronger, the unspoken feelings more intense. I found myself thinking about him more and more, replaying our conversations in my mind, wondering what it would be like if things were different. It was a dangerous game I was playing, one that I knew could only end in disaster, but I couldn't stop myself. I was drawn to him in ways I didn't understand, ways I knew I shouldn't feel. Then came the night that changed everything, again. Catherine was out of town once more, this time visiting her parents for the weekend. Mark called me asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. I hesitated, knowing it was a bad idea, but I couldn't bring myself to say no. I told myself it was just dinner, just two friends catching up, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. When I arrived at their house, Mark greeted me with a warm smile, the tension between us still there, but hidden beneath the surface. We talked over dinner, the conversation easy and familiar, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something we both felt but neither of us acknowledged. After dinner, we moved to the living room, each of us with a glass of wine in hand. The conversation grew quieter, more intimate, and I could feel the distance between us shrinking. There was a moment when our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew. I knew that if I didn't leave, something was going to happen, something that would change everything. But I didn't leave. Instead, I stayed. And when Mark leaned in to kiss me, I didn't pull away. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if we were both giving ourselves a chance to stop before it went too far. But neither of us stopped. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, and all the emotions I had been trying to suppress came rushing to the surface. We ended up in the bedroom, our clothes discarded in a trail from the living room to the bed. What happened next was a blur of passion, of tangled limbs and whispered words, of emotions too intense to contain. It was exhilarating, intoxicating, and for a few brief hours I forgot about everything else. I forgot about Catherine, about the betrayal, about the consequences. All that mattered was the way Mark made me feel, the way he seemed to fill a void I hadn't even realized was there. But when it was over, reality came crashing down around me. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling as the weight of what I had done settled over me like a heavy blanket. I had just slept with my best friend's husband. I had betrayed the person I loved most in this world, and there was no way to undo it. Mark reached out to touch my arm, his fingers gentle against my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, but I wasn't fine. I was anything but fine. I felt sick to my stomach, overwhelmed by a wave of guilt so intense it was hard to breathe. How could I have done this? How could I have betrayed Catherine like this? Mark seemed to sense my turmoil, and he pulled me into his arms, holding me close as if he could somehow protect me from the storm that was raging inside me. But his embrace, instead of offering comfort, only amplified the guilt I felt. I could feel the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and all I could think about was how wrong it was, how terribly, unforgivably wrong. "I'm sorry," he whispered into my hair. "I never meant for this to happen." I nodded, but I couldn't find the words to respond. The reality of what we had done was sinking in, and it felt like I was drowning in a sea of regret and shame. I wanted to turn back time, to erase the past few hours, but I knew that wasn't possible. What was done, and now I had to live with the consequences. "We can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "We have to stop, Mark. This can never happen again." He pulled back slightly, just enough to look me in the eyes. I could see the conflict written all over his face, the same battle that was raging inside me. "I know," he said softly, "but it's not that simple, is it? I can't just turn off what I feel for you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt the tears welling up in my eyes. "But we have to," I whispered, desperate to cling to whatever shred of morality I had left. "Catherine, she doesn't deserve this. She doesn't deserve to be hurt like this." Mark closed his eyes, as if he was trying to block out the truth of my words. "I know," he said again, his voice thick with emotion, "but I can't pretend that what happened tonight doesn't mean anything. I can't pretend that I don't care about you, that I don't want you." His confession hit me like a ton of bricks, and I felt the tears spill over, running down my cheeks in hot, shameful streams. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same way, that I was just as drawn to him as he was to me, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words. It didn't matter what I felt, because what we had done was wrong, so wrong, and no amount of feelings could change that. "I have to go," I said suddenly, pulling away from him. I couldn't stay there, couldn't bear to be in that bed, in that house, for another second. I needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and this mistake as possible. Mark didn't try to stop me. He watched in silence as I quickly got dressed, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely manage to button my shirt. I could feel his eyes on me the whole time, and it took every ounce of willpower I had not to break down completely. When I was finally dressed, I turned to leave, but Mark's voice stopped me in my tracks. "Please don't hate me," he said softly, his voice filled with a vulnerability I hadn't heard before. "Please, don't hate yourself." I couldn't bring myself to respond. I just turned and walked out of the room, out of the house, into the cold night air that hit me like a slap in the face. I felt like I was in a daze as I made my way to my car, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts, none of them coherent. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything other than the overwhelming guilt that was consuming me, the image of Catherine's smiling face flashing in my mind, like a cruel reminder of what I had just done. How could I face her after this? How could I look her in the eye, knowing that I had betrayed her in the worst possible way? When I finally got home, I collapsed onto my bed, the weight of everything crashing down on me all at once. I cried until I had no tears left, my body shaking with the force of my sobs. I had ruined everything: my friendship with Catherine, her marriage, my own sense of self-worth. I didn't know how I was going to pick up the pieces, how I was going to move forward from this. The days that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I tried to avoid Catherine as much as possible, making up excuses whenever she wanted to hang out or talk. I couldn't bear to face her, couldn't bear the thought of her finding out what I had done. But at the same time, the guilt was eating me alive, gnawing at me every second of every day. I knew I couldn't keep this secret forever, but I didn't know how to confess, how to tell her the truth without destroying her. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was at home, trying to distract myself with work when my phone rang. It was Catherine. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, before I answered. "Hey, Kat," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you come over?" she asked, her voice sounding strangely flat. "Sure," I replied, the pit in my stomach growing. "I'll be right there." The drive to her house felt like an eternity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she knew. but I pushed the thought aside, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. When I arrived, Catherine greeted me at the door with a strained smile, her eyes red and puffy as if she'd been crying. "Are you okay?" I asked, my heart sinking. "I just need to talk to you," she said quietly, leading me into the living room. We sat down on the couch, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel my pulse quickening, my palms sweating as I waited for her to speak. "I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice trembling, "but I think something's going on between you and Mark." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the color drain from my face. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaky. Catherine looked at me, her eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. "I'm not stupid," she said softly. "I've seen the way you two look at each other, the way you've been avoiding me. I found messages on his phone, messages from you." I felt like the world was collapsing around me. I wanted to deny it, to lie and tell her she was imagining things, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't lie to her anymore. "Catherine, I began, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The tears started to spill down her cheeks and she shook her head as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. "How could you do this to me? To us?" I wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but I knew I had no right. I had betrayed her in the worst possible way, and there was nothing I could say or do to make it better. "I never meant for this to happen," I said, my own tears falling. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," she replied, her voice rising. "You ruined everything. You ruined my marriage, our friendship, everything." I couldn't argue with her. She was right. I had destroyed everything that mattered to me, and now I was left to face the consequences. "Get out," Catherine said suddenly, her voice cold and hard. "I don't ever want to see you again." I felt like I'd been slapped. I had known this was coming, had known that our friendship was over the moment I crossed that line with Mark, but hearing her say it was like a knife to the heart. I wanted to beg for her forgiveness, to plead with her to give me another chance, but I knew it was useless. I had lost her, and there was no getting her back. Without another word, I got up and left, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me like a physical burden. As I drove away, I felt numb, like I was in a daze. I had lost everything: my best friend, the man I thought I loved, and my own sense of self. I didn't know how I was going to move forward, how I was going to live with what I had done. In the weeks that followed, I tried to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. I moved out of the city, needing to put as much distance between myself and the mess I had created as possible. I started over in a new place where no one knew me, where I could try to forget about the past. But no matter how far I ran, the guilt followed me. It was always there, lurking in the background, a constant reminder of the person I had become. As for Mark and Catherine, I heard through mutual friends that they had separated, and I knew it was my fault. I had destroyed their marriage, their lives, and I would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my days. The love I had felt for Mark, the passion that had consumed us, now felt like a curse, something that had ruined everything it touched. And so here I am, alone in a new city, trying to rebuild a life that I shattered with my own hands. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself, if I'll ever be able to move on from the mistakes I made, but I do know that I'll never make those mistakes again. I'll never betray someone I love like that again, because I've learned the hard way that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed, and some betrayals can never be forgiven.